Hello and welcome to Short Stories, brought to you by the National Taichung University of Science and Technology Language Center. Today's short story is called The Wolf and the Sheep. It's based on one of Aesop's fables, and it teaches us the lesson that a bully will make any excuse for his tyranny. Might makes right, as we say in the English-speaking world. Okay, before I read the story, I will tell you the vocabulary and example sentences. After I have read the story, I will ask you 4 listening comprehension questions. All right, time to get started. Vocabulary. Sharecropper. Sharecropper. Sharecroppers must harvest their crops every autumn. Trespass. Trespass. The man pleaded guilty to the charge of trespassing. Guilty. Guilty. The jury found the defendant guilty. Objection. Objection. If you want to travel to Spain, I have no objections. Contempt. Contempt of court. The witness was held in contempt of court for not cooperating. Step out of line. Step out of line. If you step out of line one more time, you're fired. Deliberate. Deliberate. The jury carefully deliberated the case. Restitution. Restitution. The judge ordered the company to pay full restitution to the victims whose health was harmed. Now the story. There once was a little sheep who lived in a valley. Like most sheep in this valley, he was a farmer. He didn't have a lot of land, but it was of good quality and it was his. All of his neighbors were sharecroppers, and most of the land was owned by the wolf. In fact, the wolf was the biggest landlord in the entire valley. One day, while working in his field, the little sheep became thirsty. He went to the stream that separated his property from his neighbors and took a drink and washed the sweat from his face. The wolf, who was obsessed with the little sheep and his land, was watching from behind some bushes. He stepped out and said, "What do you think you are doing with my water?" The little sheep was surprised to see the wolf and was taken aback. He replied, "Huh? I thought this was public water." The wolf growled and said, "Well, it's not. My deed says I own this land and the stream, so that makes this water my water." The little sheep was kind of annoyed by the wolf's attitude and said, "So sue me." And that's exactly what the wolf did. The wolf filed a lawsuit against the sheep the very next day. A fox knocked on the sheep's door. The sheep answered it and asked, "Can I help you?" The fox said, "Yes, you can help me by attending court Friday at noon. Here is your subpoena. Have a nice day." The little sheep was shocked and angry. He didn't know what to say. He then read the charges that were brought against him. Trespassing, vandalism, destruction of private property, and causing emotional distress. "What?" said the sheep as he slapped his forehead. After a few minutes of stunned silence, he said to himself, "I guess I need to get a lawyer." He quickly went into town to hire a lawyer. Unfortunately, since the little sheep didn't have much money, the only lawyer he could afford was Mr. Weasel Esquire. Mr. Weasel advised him to plead guilty, but the sheep refused. That Friday, the sheep arrived at court wearing his best suit. He entered the courtroom and took a look around. The judge was Mr. Dog, a cousin of the wolf, and in the jury box sat 12 coyotes. "I've got a bad feeling about this," said the sheep. The judge banged his gavel to start the proceedings. "Mr. Sheep, how do you plead?" asked the judge. "Not guilty, Your Honor," answered the sheep. Then Mr. Weasel gave his opening statement. "Your Honor, my client is just a simple farmer and didn't know what he was doing. It's not his fault that sheep have smaller brains and poor judgment. I ask the court to show him mercy." Next came the lawyer for the wolf, Mr. Fox. "Your Honor, this hooligan is clearly guilty of the charges brought against him. I would like to add the charge of wasting the court's time by not pleading guilty, if I may." The judge thought about it for a second and said, "I'll allow it. Clerk, add wasting the court's time to the list of charges." Things were not going well for Mr. Sheep. Several hours passed as the two lawyers went back and forth. Eventually, it was Mr. Sheep's turn to take the stand. The clerk swore him in. "Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "Yes," said the sheep, and then he took his seat below the judge. Mr. Fox asked him, "On the day of August 5th, did you drink out of a stream next to your field?" The sheep answered yes. "And did you wash your face in that stream as well?" The sheep answered yes. "Why did you do that?" The sheep answered, "Because it was hot and my face was dirty." "You see, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," shouted the fox, "he admits to contaminating my client's water supply with hazardous waste." The jury nodded in agreement. "Hazardous waste? Now hold on just a minute, you stupid," yelled the sheep. "Objection," interrupted Mr. Fox. "Your Honor, I ask that you charge the defendant with contempt." "For what?" said the sheep indignantly. "For badgering the lawyer," said the fox. The judge banged his gavel and said, "Mr. Sheep, I'm warning you, don't step out of line again." The trial continued for a few more hours. At the end, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. 5 minutes later, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The judge then gave his ruling on the punishment. "I order you to pay restitution to Mr. Wolf, equal to $1 million. The little sheep sat in his chair. "I'd have to sell my farm to pay that much," he lamented. Mr. Wolf smiled. "I think we can make an arrangement." So in the end, Mr. Sheep was forced to sell his farm to the wolf, who then kicked Mr. Sheep out of his house. Poor Mr. Sheep was homeless and had no place to go. Not long after this, the wolf ran into Mr. Sheep on a lonely country road. It was late, and there was no one else around. "Not you again," said the sheep. "Haven't you done enough to me already?" The wolf, who was feeling quite hungry after a long day of collecting rent, decided he had better have a snack. Without saying a word, he swallowed the little sheep whole. Now the questions. Number 1. Why was the wolf interested in the sheep? A. He wanted his wool. B. He wanted his land. C. He was in love with him. D. He wanted to be his business partner. The answer is B. He wanted his land. Question 2. Who was the judge? A. A relative of Mr. Sheep. B. A relative of Mr. Weasel. C. A relative of Mr. Wolf. D. Mr. Fox. The answer is C. The judge was Mr. Dog, a cousin of Mr. Wolf. Question 3. Why did the sheep hire Mr. Weasel to be his lawyer? A. He was the best lawyer in town. B. He was the only lawyer in town. C. Mr. Weasel agreed to help him for free. D. He was the only lawyer Mr. Sheep could afford. The answer is D. He was the only lawyer that Mr. Sheep could afford. Question 4. What was the end result of the trial? A. Mr. Sheep was convicted. B. Mr. Sheep was acquitted. C. There was a mistrial. D. The jury couldn't make a decision. The answer is A. He was convicted. Convicted means that he was guilty. Acquitted means that he was not guilty. Mistrial means that there was a mistake and the trial needs to, cancel and they need to do it again. And D, if the jury doesn't make a decision, that usually results in a mistrial. That concludes today's short story. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a valuable lesson about how the powerful can misuse the justice system to get whatever they want. That's a terrible lesson, but it's true nonetheless. All right, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.